ranking member, and then we'll go right to our witnesses. I also want to start off this hearing by saying something that I think is very clear and already obvious. My colleagues, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, support our troops. We are all deeply grateful for their sacrifices. We know that so many men and women have voluntarily put their lives on the line to defend this country and our freedom. But it's probably just as obvious that the actions of our government are not meeting our aspirations. We saw that vividly and unforgettably when we had the hearing and we watched the disgraceful conditions at Walter Reed. We saw it again when our government officials made an intolerable breach by making public the secret and classified CIA identity of Valerie Plame Wilson. And we're going to see it again this morning. The bare minimum we owe our soldiers and their families is the truth. That didn't happen for two of the most famous soldiers in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. For Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman, the government violated its most basic responsibility. Sensational details and stories were invented in both cases. Sometimes because of the fog of war, the first reports from the battlefield are inaccurate. But that doesn't seem to explain what happened here. In Jessica Lynch's case, the first reports were right. It was the follow-up stories published 10 days after her capture that discarded the facts and misled the country. The Washington Post published a front-page story on April 2nd, 2003. It was written by Vernon Loeb and Dana Priest, and it got the story right. I want to read the lead paragraphs. Jessica Lynch, a 19-year-old private first class, missing since the ambush of an Army maintenance company 10 days ago in southern Iraq, has been rescued by Special Operations Forces, defense officials said yesterday. CIA operatives in Iraq located Lynch in a hospital near Nasiriyah, where she was being held because of multiple wounds, officials said, and a helicopter-borne team of Navy SEALs and Army Rangers rescued her about midnight local time. That was an accurate statement. But the next day, April 3, the Washington Post ran another front-page story. This one was written by Susan Schmidt and Vernon Loeb, and the contrast with the April 2 story is remarkable. Here's what the Post reported. PFC Jessica Lynch, rescued Tuesday from an Iraqi hospital, fought fiercely and shot several enemy soldiers after Iraqi forces ambushed the Army's 507th Ordnance Maintenance Company, firing her weapon until she ran out of ammunition, U.S. officials said yesterday. Lynch, a 19-year-old supply clerk, continued firing at the Iraqis even after she sustained multiple gunshot wounds and watched several other soldiers in her unit die around her in fighting March 23, one official said. Where did this false information come from? Jessica Lynch was captured on March 23. The Washington Post published a completely factual article on her rescue on April 2nd. But then they went on, 10 days after her capture, U.S. officials had become the source of a report that riveted the nation, but twisted the truth beyond recognition. It's 4 years later, and we still don't know who's responsible or why they did it. All we really know is that they did a great disservice to Jessica Lynch. And so I want to say to Private Lynch and her family who are here today, this committee is going to do its best to find out the source of the fabrications that you had to endure. We want to know whether they were the result of incompetence or a deliberate strategy to spin a compelling story at a critical time. And we'll do our best to find out who should be held accountable. Everyone on this committee is also familiar with Pat Tillman's case, and we all share our sympathies with his wife, Marie, his mother, Mary, his father Patrick, his brother Kevin, and his entire family. But his family wants more than our sympathies and apologies. They want answers. They deserve them. Pat Tillman was killed by members of his own platoon on April 22, 2004, 3 years ago this past Sunday. But since then, the family has been unable to learn why the military told the world that Corporal Tillman had been killed by the enemy when in fact they knew he had died from friendly fire. News of the fratricide flew up the chain of command within days, but the Tillman family was kept in the dark for more than a month. Many military officials sat in silence during a nationally televised memorial ceremony highlighting Pat Tillman's fight against the terrorists. Evidence was destroyed. Witness statements were doctored. The Tillman family wants to know how all of this could have happened, and they want to know whether these actions were all just accidents or whether they were deliberate. In working on this hearing, the committee has learned of many other cases in which the military failed to tell the families the truth. Sergeant Eddie Ryan was a victim of friendly fire during his second tour in Iraq. He sustained 2 gunshot wounds to the head and thankfully is still alive. But he didn't find out the truth about his injuries until 5 months later, even though his fellow Marines knew immediately that his injuries were due to friendly fire. Other families, like those of First Lieutenant Sarah K. Small, Private First Class Lavina Johnson, and Lieutenant Callard, have been forced to file Freedom of Information Act requests in order to obtain information about the deaths of their loved ones. These families have asked the military repeatedly for basic information, but they have been ignored or dismissed with slow and incomplete answers. And this is simply unacceptable. One of the things that makes the Afghanistan and Iraq wars so different from previous wars is the glaring disparity in sacrifice. For the overwhelming number of Americans, this war has brought no sacrifice and no inconvenience. But for a small number of Americans, the war has demanded incredible and constant sacrifice. Those soldiers and their families pay that price proudly and without complaint. That's why Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman did. That's what they did, and it's what their families have done. But our government has failed them. Our government hasn't done right by them, and I hope in some small but important way this hearing can begin to right those wrongs. The least we owe to our courageous men and women who are fighting for our freedom is the truth. And that's what we're going to insist on in this hearing and in our subsequent examination and investigation. I want to now recognize